Growing up, the world seemed to have a fixed set of rules, and the first one I ever learned was that my sister Isabel was beautiful. It wasn't just a fact, it was a force of nature, an undeniable truth that shaped our entire childhood. She had the kind of effortless glow that artists try to capture in paintings. Sun-kissed hair that fell in perfect waves, eyes the color of a summer sky, and a smile that could disarm even the most stubborn heart. I, on the other hand, was Amelia. Just Amelia. The quiet one, the smart one, the one with the mousy brown hair and the perpetually thoughtful expression. I was the shadow that proved how brightly my sister shone. Our family photo albums are a testament to this reality. In every picture, Isabel is the centerpiece, a vibrant splash of color and light. She'd be laughing, her head thrown back, while I stood slightly to the side, my smile a little smaller, my posture a little less certain. It wasn't that my parents loved me less. They were kind and supportive in their own way. But Isabel's beauty was a currency that bought her attention, praise, and a seemingly endless supply of goodwill from relatives, teachers, and strangers alike. "Oh, Isabel, you look like a little angel," they'd coo. Then, they'd turn to me, pat my head, and say, "And Amelia, you must be the clever one. It's always good to have a clever one in the family." I learned to live in that comfortable, predictable shade. I found my solace in books, in the quiet corners of the library, and in the intricate worlds I could build in my own mind. While Isabel was out at parties, surrounded by a constellation of admirers, I was tracing the constellations in astronomy books, finding a strange comfort in their silent, distant beauty. I convinced myself that it was enough, that I didn't need the spotlight, that I was happier in the wings, observing. I became her confidant, the one she came to when the pressures of being so universally adored became too much. I helped her with her homework, wrote her essays, and listened patiently as she complained about boys who were too intimidated to talk to her. I was the reliable, steady sister, the anchor to her glittering ship. The summer I turned 21 was no different. Isabel, a year older, was home from college, and her presence filled our house with a renewed energy. Her friends were always over, their laughter echoing through the halls, the scent of perfume and hairspray clinging to the air. That year, our town was hosting its annual Founders' Day festival, and a well-known photographer, a man named Julian Vance, had been hired to capture the spirit of the community. His work was famous for its raw, candid style, and everyone was buzzing with the hope of being noticed by him. Of course, it was a foregone conclusion that Isabel would be one of his subjects. My mother had been talking about it for weeks. "Isabel, you should wear that blue sundress," she'd say. "It brings out the color of your eyes. Mr. Vance will be looking for people who truly represent the heart of our town." The implication was clear. Isabel, with her radiant beauty, was the town's heart. The day of the festival was hot and bright. Isabel looked ethereal in her blue dress, her hair braided with small white flowers. I wore a simple linen shirt and jeans, feeling more like a stagehand than a participant. We walked through the crowded park, and just as my mother had predicted, Julian Vance's eyes landed on my sister. He was an older man with a kind face and intense, observant eyes. He approached us with a warm smile. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm Julian Vance. I'm the photographer for the festival, and I couldn't help but be struck by you." He was looking directly at Isabel, who gave him her signature charming smile. "I'd be honored if you'd let me take a few portraits of you by the old oak tree over there." Isabel agreed naturally. I stood back, holding her purse and phone, falling into my familiar role. Julian was a true artist. He didn't pose her stiffly. Instead, he talked to her, made her laugh, and captured moments of genuine joy. She was magnificent, and even I, who had seen her beauty every day of my life, was in awe. After about 20 minutes, he thanked her profusely. "You are a natural," he said. "Truly." As he started packing up his camera, my mother, who had been watching from a distance, came bustling over. "Weren't they wonderful, Amelia?" she whispered to me, her eyes gleaming with pride. I nodded, a familiar ache settling in my chest. It was the ache of being invisible. But then, something unexpected happened. Julian Vance turned, and his gaze fell on me. He wasn't looking past me or through me. He was looking at me. He tilted his head, his brow furrowed in concentration. For a long moment, he was silent, and I felt my cheeks flush, assuming he was just trying to figure out how the plain sister could possibly be related to the stunning one. He took a step closer. "You," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Your sister is lovely, a classic beauty. But you have a story in your eyes." He gestured with his hand. "Would you mind?" I'd like to take a few shots of just you. Not her. Just you. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The background noise of the festival, the distant music, the chatter of the crowd, the laughter of children, all of it faded into a dull hum. The only thing that felt real was Julian Vance's request, hanging in the air between us. Just you. Not her. Just you. The words echoed in my mind, a strange and powerful incantation. I looked at Isabel, expecting her to laugh or to politely correct him, to explain that he must be mistaken, that I was the wrong sister. But Isabel wasn't laughing. For the first time I could remember, her perfect smile had vanished. In its place was an expression I had never seen on her face before, a flicker of bewilderment, quickly masked by a tight, polite facade. My mother was equally stunned, her mouth slightly agape as she looked from Julian to me and back again, as if she couldn't compute what was happening. It was as if the sun had suddenly decided to apologize to a shadow for blocking its light. Me? The word escaped my lips as a faint whisper. I felt a nervous flutter in my stomach, a primal instinct to shrink back, to point to my sister and say, "You want her? Everyone always wants her." Julian's kind eyes held my gaze. "Yes, you," he affirmed, his tone leaving no room for argument. "There's a quiet strength in your face, a resilience. It's compelling. Please?" Slowly, hesitantly, I nodded. I felt like I was moving in a dream as I handed my own small bag to my mother and walked towards the same ancient oak tree where Isabel had so effortlessly posed just minutes before. The bark was rough and textured under my fingertips. I didn't know what to do with my hands, where to look, how to stand. I was acutely aware of Isabel and my mother watching me, their silent judgment a palpable weight. I felt like an imposter, a common field sparrow trying to occupy the perch of a peacock. Julian raised his camera, but he didn't immediately start shooting. He just watched me for a moment, his head tilted. "Don't try to be anything," he said softly. "Don't smile for me. Don't pose. Just be. Think about something. A book you love. A place you want to go. A secret you've never told." His words were a permission slip I never knew I needed. I stopped trying to figure out what he wanted to see and let my mind drift. I thought about the ending of a novel I'd read the night before, a bittersweet conclusion that had left me feeling both hollow and full. I thought about the stars I traced from my bedroom window, how they were already ancient history by the time their light reached me. I thought about the quiet hum of the library on a rainy afternoon. My posture softened. My hands, which had been clenched at my sides, relaxed. My gaze drifted towards the horizon, lost in my own world. Click. The sound of the shutter was soft, unobtrusive. "That's it," Julian murmured, more to himself than to me. "Stay right there. Now look at me. But don't look at the camera. Look through it. Tell me what you're seeing without saying a word." I met his lens, but I wasn't thinking about the photograph. I was thinking about his words. "You have a story in your eyes." What was my story? Was it one of resentment? Of quiet acceptance? Or was it something else entirely, something I hadn't even discovered yet? For a fleeting moment, I felt a surge of defiance, a spark of anger at always being secondary. I let that feeling rise to the surface. Click, click. "Wonderful," he breathed. He asked me to lean against the tree, to run my hand along the rough bark. He didn't ask me to laugh or to dazzle. He asked me to be thoughtful, to be introspective, to be real. While Isabel's photo shoot had been a celebration of light and surface, mine felt like an excavation of depth and shadow. He was photographing not my face, but my soul. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being compared to my sister. I was being seen for myself. The entire process took no more than 10 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. When he finally lowered his camera, he had a look of profound satisfaction on his face. "Thank you, Amelia," he said, and the way he spoke my name felt different, imbued with a new significance. That was truly special. "You have a rare gift." I mumbled a thank you, my cheeks burning, and walked back towards my family. The air was thick with an unspoken tension. Isabel had composed herself, her dazzling smile back in place, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. My mother was fussing with her purse, avoiding my gaze. "Well, that was interesting," my mother said, her voice unnaturally bright. Isabel linked her arm through mine, her grip a little too tight. "I can't believe he wanted to take pictures of my bookworm sister," she said, attempting a light, teasing tone that fell completely flat. "We'll have to see if any of them turned out." But her words held a new edge, a subtle tremor of insecurity I had never heard before. As we walked away from the oak tree and Julian Vance, I felt the familiar dynamic between us begin to fracture. The shadow had been acknowledged by the sun, and I had a feeling that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The car ride home from the festival was a masterclass in unspoken tension. Usually, after a town event, our car would be filled with chatter, my mother recounting who she'd met, Isabel detailing the compliments she'd received. But now, a heavy silence pressed in on us, punctuated only by the soft hum of the engine. My mother kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, a worried frown creasing her forehead. Isabel stared out the passenger window, her reflection a beautiful, unreadable mask. I sat in the back, feeling like a foreign object, a stone dropped into the placid waters of my family's predictable life. The space I occupied suddenly felt larger, and I wasn't sure I knew how to fill it. In the days that followed, a strange and subtle war began in our home. It was a war fought not with angry words, but with carefully chosen silences and backhanded compliments. Isabel, who had always been so effortlessly confident, began to perform her beauty with a new, almost desperate intensity. She would spend longer on her makeup, try on multiple outfits just to go to the grocery store, and post a constant stream of flawless selfies online, garnering the usual flood of praise. She made a point of referencing the photo shoot with a kind of pitying humor. "I'm so curious to see what Julian got of you," she said one evening at dinner, her voice syrupy sweet. "It was so artistic and moody. He probably made you look like one of those tragic poets." She smiled at me, but the smile was a weapon. "I'm just glad he caught my good side before he got all creative." My mother, trying to restore the family's natural equilibrium, began to overcompensate. She would praise Isabel's looks with a renewed fervor. "Isabel, honey, your hair looks like spun gold today." Or, "That color makes your eyes simply sparkle." To me, she offered a different kind of encouragement, one that felt like a consolation prize. "Amelia, that book you're reading looks very challenging. You're so dedicated to your studies." She was trying to put us back into our designated boxes. Isabel the beautiful, Amelia the smart. It was her way of trying to smooth over the cracks that had appeared, but all it did was make me feel more keenly the chasm that was opening between my sister and me. I retreated into myself as I always had. I spent hours in my room, my books piled around me like a fortress. But the words on the pages, once my greatest escape, now felt different. I'd catch myself rereading the same paragraph over and over, my mind drifting back to the feeling of Julian Vance's camera on me. To his words, "You have a story in your eyes." I started to look at myself differently in the mirror. I had always avoided my own reflection, but now I would search my own eyes, trying to see what he had seen. I saw the quietness, yes, but for the first time, I also saw a flicker of something else. A longing, a sadness, but also a strength I had never acknowledged. It was the strength of a survivor, the resilience of a wildflower growing in the shade of a magnificent rose. 2 weeks after the festival, an article appeared in the local newspaper's online edition. "Julian Vance captures the soul of our community," the headline read. My heart hammered against my ribs. The article mentioned that the full gallery would be displayed on the town's official website, and that a selection of the best portraits would be exhibited at the local library. The three of us, my mother, Isabel, and I, gathered around the laptop in the living room. It felt like waiting for a verdict. My mother clicked the link to the gallery. Dozens of thumbnail images appeared, a vibrant mosaic of faces from the festival. The first large photo at the top of the page was of the mayor, shaking hands with a child. We scrolled down. There were pictures of families, of elderly couples, of teenagers laughing. And then, there was Isabel. It was a breathtaking shot, the one Julian had taken when he'd made her laugh. She was caught in a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, her head thrown back, the sunlight catching in her hair. She looked like a goddess. A wave of relief washed over my mother. "Oh, Isabel, look at you. It's the most beautiful picture I've ever seen," she gushed. Isabel leaned closer to the screen, a genuine, relieved smile spreading across her face. The universe was righting itself. She was the star. I felt the familiar, dull ache of my own invisibility returning. Perhaps Julian had just been being kind. Perhaps my photos hadn't turned out at all. It was for the best, I told myself, a sour taste in my mouth. We kept scrolling, looking for more pictures of her. And then we saw it. Further down the page, given its own space, was a portrait that was utterly different from all the others. It was in black and white. A young woman was leaning against an old oak tree, her gaze directed just past the camera, her expression one of profound and complex thought. Her face was not smiling. It was full of a quiet intensity. There was a story in her eyes. It was me. Beneath the photograph, Julian Vance had added a simple caption. It didn't say, Amelia, sister of the beautiful Isabel. It just said, Amelia, the muse of the oak tree. The silence in the living room was louder than any argument we'd ever had. The screen glowed with the image of me, a black and white ghost titled The Muse. My mother was the first to speak, her voice strained as she desperately sought to regain control of the narrative. Well, isn't that nice? She said, her tone falsely bright. It's a very artistic choice. Black and white is so dramatic, Amelia. She was trying to frame it as an oddity, a quirky side note to Isabel's bright, perfect, normal beauty. Isabel let out a sharp, brittle laugh that held no humor. The muse of the oak tree? She scoffed, leaning back from the computer as if it offended her. My God, how pretentious can you get? He makes it sound like you were sitting there composing a symphony instead of just looking miserable. Her words were darts, and they were aimed to kill. I can't believe he even published that one. It's so gloomy. I said nothing. I just stared at the picture. For the first time, I wasn't seeing myself through the lens of my family's expectations. I was seeing what a stranger, an artist, had seen. He hadn't seen miserable or gloomy. He had seen a story. He had seen me. A strange sense of calm settled over me. A quiet ownership of that image. It was mine. The feeling was so new, so unfamiliar, that it didn't leave room for a snappy retort. The battle lines had been drawn. Over the next week, the photograph became a specter in our house. The news of the gallery spread through our small town, and the exhibition at the library was set to open that weekend. My mother's friends would call, and I'd hear her strained conversations through the walls. Yes, both girls had their pictures taken. Isabel's is just stunning, isn't it? So full of life. Oh, Amelia's? Yes, very different. An interesting character study, I suppose. She was working tirelessly to maintain the hierarchy. Isabel, meanwhile, swung between icy silence and pointed jabs. She would accidentally leave magazines open on the coffee table to pages featuring conventionally beautiful models, or she would talk loudly on the phone with her friends about how some photographers try way too hard to be deep, but the most painful moments were the quiet ones. The way she would look at me when she thought I wasn't watching, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and a deep, profound hurt that I was only just beginning to understand. Her beauty had been her identity, her power, the one thing she could always count on. My photograph hadn't just put me in the spotlight. It had cast a shadow over her. Things came to a head the day before the library exhibition opened. I was in my room trying to read when Isabel walked in without knocking, closing the door behind her. She was holding her phone, her knuckles white. "Are you happy now?" she asked, her voice trembling with a barely suppressed rage. I looked up from my book, confused. "Happy about what?" "Don't play dumb with me, Amelia," she snapped, taking a step closer. "You've finally done it. You've managed to steal the one thing that was ever mine." "Steal it?" I stood up, my own anger beginning to spark. "I didn't steal anything. I didn't do anything. I just stood there." "Oh, please," she cried, her voice rising. "You've been waiting for this your whole life. Don't think I never saw you. Hiding behind your books, looking at me and Mom and all my friends with your big, sad, judgmental eyes. You always thought you were better than us, smarter than us. And now you have a gloomy, artistic picture to prove it. Everyone is talking about it. About the muse. You've made me a joke." Every word was a blow, but something inside me, that new, fragile sense of self, refused to break. "You think this was about you?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "You think my entire life has been a reaction to you? That's the problem, Izzy. Everything has always been about you. For 21 years, I have been Isabel's sister. The plain one, the smart one, the shadow. And I accepted it. I lived with it. But this one thing, this one tiny moment, had nothing to do with you. A man saw something in me that had nothing to do with my relationship to you. And it kills you, doesn't it? It kills you that for 5 minutes of fame, I wasn't just your supporting character." Tears were streaming down her face now. Tears of pure rage and wounded pride. "You were jealous," she accused. "Of course I was jealous," I finally admitted, the confession ripping from my throat. I was a human being growing up next to the sun. How could I not be? People gave you the world because you were beautiful. But this picture isn't about jealousy, and it isn't about you. It's about me. And for the first time in my life, I'm not going to feel guilty for being seen. The room was electric with 2 decades of unspoken feelings. We stared at each other, the beautiful sister and the muse, and the chasm between us had become a canyon. The foundation of our relationship, of our very identities, had crumbled, and in its place was a raw, uncertain, and terrifying new ground. After our fight, the house was suffocatingly quiet. Isabel stayed in her room, and I stayed in mine. The anger had drained away, leaving behind a hollow sorrow. The truth had been spoken, raw and ugly, and it lay between us like shattered glass. I realized that the library exhibition was that evening, and a part of me wanted to hide, to let the moment pass and allow things to settle back into a familiar, if painful, routine. But then I looked at my reflection in the dark window pane, and I heard Julian's voice in my head once more. "You have a story in your eyes." I couldn't unhear it. I couldn't unsee what he had shown me. I couldn't go back into the shadows. I decided to go to the exhibition, and I decided to go alone. The library was buzzing with quiet activity. People milled about, speaking in hushed tones as they admired the portraits lining the walls. The photographs were beautiful, a true tapestry of our town. I saw Isabel's portrait from across the room. It was vibrant, radiant, and people smiled when they looked at it. It was a picture of pure happiness. Then, I turned a corner and saw my own. It was larger than I expected, and the black and white tones gave it a gravity that was startling. It was placed on a wall by itself. As I stood there, 2 women I didn't know stopped beside me. "That's my favorite one," one of them whispered. "The others are pretty, but this one, it makes you feel something. It makes you want to know her story." My breath caught in my throat. They weren't comparing me to Isabel. They were just seeing me. I was so absorbed in the moment that I didn't notice Isabel until she was standing beside me. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the portrait. She wore no makeup, and her hair was simply tied back. She looked younger, more vulnerable than I had seen her in years. I braced myself for another cutting remark, another sarcastic jab, but it never came. She was silent for a long time, her eyes tracing the lines of my face in the photograph. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, stripped of all its previous anger. "I always thought your quietness was a judgment," she said, her gaze still fixed on the wall. "Like you were living in a secret world that I was too shallow to be a part of. It made me feel stupid." The confession hung in the air, so honest it almost hurt to hear. "I wasn't judging you," I whispered back. "I was hiding. I didn't think I could compete, so I didn't even try. I built walls out of books so I wouldn't have to feel so invisible next to you." Isabel finally turned to look at me, and her eyes were filled with a sorrow that mirrored my own. "Invisible? Amelia, you were never invisible to me. You were my anchor. You were the smart one, the steady one. When everyone was looking at my face, you were the only one who ever listened to what I was actually saying. I was jealous of you." The absurdity of it all washed over me. For our entire lives, we had been 2 sides of the same coin, each believing the other possessed something she lacked. She envied my mind. I envied her beauty. We had been so busy protecting our own fragile identities that we had failed to see the truth. We were never in competition. "He was right, you know," Isabel said, gesturing toward the portrait. "There is a story in your eyes. It's a beautiful one." Tears welled in my eyes, but for the first time, they were not tears of sadness or jealousy. They were tears of release. She then looked over at her own portrait, the laughing, radiant girl in the sun. "That girl is beautiful," she said softly. "But she's also terrified that if the smile fades, she'll disappear." She looked back at me. "I don't want to be just that girl anymore." In the quiet of the library, surrounded by the captured souls of our community, my sister and I found each other again. We left our designated boxes behind, the ones labeled the pretty one and the smart one. We walked out of the library that night not as the sun and its shadow, but as 2 stars, each with our own light, ready to find our own place in the same sky. Our relationship wouldn't be perfect overnight, but it would be real. And for the first time, that felt like more than enough. Sometimes the roles we are given by others are not the roles we are meant to play. We spend so much time looking at the world, we forget to look at ourselves and see the unique story that is held within our own eyes. True beauty isn't about being flawless or being the center of attention. It's about the courage to be seen for who you truly are, with all your complexities, shadows, and light. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own unique and beautiful light.